Welcome to Cozy English. Tonight's stories are about work, about what we do, why we do it, and what it costs and gives us in return. They are about the small victories and the long defeats, about learning on the job, about ambition and patience and the slow building of something that matters. These are not grand stories of overnight success. They are the quieter kind, the kind that feel true because they are made of real things. Early mornings, difficult conversations, moments of doubt, and the occasional, hard-won satisfaction of a job done well. Listen and let the English come to you. You do not need to strain. Just rest and receive. And if this channel helps you, please subscribe. It lets us keep making content for learners around the world. Let's begin. Story 1. The Promotion. Sylvia had been working at the publishing house for 6 years when the senior editor position opened up. She found out about it the way she found out about most things at work, by accident, through a conversation she wasn't supposed to hear. She was making coffee in the small kitchen off the main corridor when she caught a fragment of her manager's voice from the half-open office door. Need to fill Marcus's role by the end of the quarter. Marcus. He was leaving. She hadn't known. She put down her coffee cup and stood very still for a moment, thinking. She had always assumed, in the vague, unexamined way that people sometimes made plans, that she would go for a senior role eventually, later, when she was ready, when the time was right. The arrival of an actual vacancy, specific, immediate, real, felt different from the abstract version of ambition she had been carrying around for years. It felt like a door that would either open or close, depending on what she did next. She applied. Writing the application was harder than she expected. She sat at her kitchen table on a Sunday with her laptop and a glass of water and tried to explain, in 2 pages, why she deserved the job. She had never been good at this, at selling herself, at laying out her achievements as if they were items in a shop window. She rewrote the opening paragraph 4 times. Her friend Keiko, who worked in marketing and had applied for several roles over the years, told her, "Stop being modest. No one gives you credit for modesty in a job application. They give you credit for confidence." "But what if I'm not confident?" Sylvia said. "Then fake it until you write it," Keiko said. "And then, when you reread it, you'll start to believe it." This turned out to be surprisingly accurate. By the 3rd draft, something had shifted in the writing. It no longer read like an apology. It read like a case. She submitted it. The interview was on a Thursday. 3 people on the panel. Her manager, Diane, a senior director she had met twice, and the head of editorial, whom she had spoken to at the Christmas party once, and whose name, with some effort, she had remembered, Jonathan. She answered their questions carefully and honestly. She made a point of being specific. Not, "I improved our processes," but, "I reduced turnaround time on manuscript feedback by 12 days. She had prepared examples and used them. She had also prepared for the question she feared most, and when Jonathan asked it, "What would you say is your biggest professional weakness?" she gave an answer she had practiced, but also meant, "I've historically been reluctant to delegate. I prefer to do things myself, because I trust my own judgment. I've been working on that, consciously, for the past year." Jonathan wrote something down. She couldn't tell what. She waited 9 days, 9 long, ordinary days in which she filed manuscripts and attended meetings and replied to emails and tried not to think about it too hard, which meant she thought about it constantly. On the 10th day, Diane called her into her office and offered her the job. Sylvia said thank you and shook Diane's hand and walked back to her desk. She sat down and looked at her screen, which was open to a spreadsheet she had been working on. She was going to be senior editor. She was going to have a team. She was going to have Marcus's office, with the window that looked out onto the small courtyard where someone had planted a lemon tree in a terracotta pot. She texted Keiko, "Got it." 3 seconds later, "Told you. Drinks tonight, no arguments." Sylvia smiled at her phone and then opened the spreadsheet and got back to work. Story 2. The Apprentice. Owen was 17 when he started his apprenticeship at the joinery workshop. He had not wanted to go to university. This had been a source of extended discussion, he would not call it argument, with his parents, who had both gone to university and considered it the obvious path. Owen had not been able to explain his reluctance precisely, only that sitting in classrooms for another 3 years felt like continuing something he had already decided was not for him. He wanted to make things with his hands. His father had, eventually, driven him to the workshop for a meeting with the master joiner, a man named Gerald, who was in his 50s, precise in his movements, and almost entirely silent during their meeting. Gerald had asked Owen 3 questions. Had he ever used any hand tools? Yes. His grandfather had taught him some basics. Could he take direction without arguing? Yes. Was he patient? Owen had thought about this for a moment, which Gerald seemed to consider a good sign, and said, "Mostly." "Mostly is honest," Gerald had said, and offered him the place. The first 6 months were humbling. Owen had expected to be making things. Instead, he swept floors, sorted timber, cleaned tools, and watched. He watched Gerald work. He watched the other 2 joiners, Petra and Sam, work. He watched the way they held things, moved things, thought about things. "You're not making me do anything useful," he said to Gerald once, at the end of a particularly long day of sweeping. Gerald picked up a chisel from the bench, turned it in his hands, and set it back down. "You've learned 14 things today," he said. "None of them involved sweeping." Owen thought about this on the bus home. He went back through the day in his mind. Gerald was right. He had watched Petra joint 2 pieces of oak and had learned something about grain direction. He had watched Sam sharpen a plane iron and had understood, for the first time, the relationship between the angle of the blade and the quality of the cut. He had seen Gerald examine a piece of timber before using it and had begun to understand what he was looking for. He was being taught, just not in the way he had expected. By the end of the first year, he could cut a mortise and tenon joint that Gerald examined without comment, which, Owen had come to understand, was a form of approval. By the end of the second year, he was making drawer boxes, cabinet carcasses, small tables. By the third year, he was being trusted with client commissions. On the day he qualified, Gerald shook his hand. "You're patient," he said. Owen remembered the question at the interview. "I've got better at it," he said. Gerald almost smiled. "We all have to," he said. "The wood requires it." Story 3. The Pitch. The presentation was at 9 in the morning, which Isabel had mixed feelings about. On one hand, it meant the whole thing would be over before the day properly began. On the other, it meant that by 8:45 she was standing in the client's reception area in a state of very controlled anxiety, while the receptionist offered her coffee and she said yes please, and then worried she would spill it. She had been preparing for this for 3 weeks. The pitch was for a branding project, a significant one, for a company that had recently expanded and needed a new visual identity to match. If they won it, it would be the largest contract her agency had ever secured. If they didn't, it would be fine. They would be fine. There would be other pitches. She told herself this regularly and believed it approximately 40% of the time. There were 4 people in the meeting room, 2 from the client company, the marketing director and her deputy, and Isabel's colleague Raj, who was handling the financial side of the proposal and who was, Isabel had noticed, completely calm. This was not because Raj was indifferent, it was because Raj had a gift for placing his anxiety neatly in a box and opening it only when required. Isabel set up the presentation on the screen and began. She had rehearsed it many times. She knew the slides well enough that she was not reading from them. She was talking about the ideas, using the slides as support rather than script. This was the single piece of advice her mentor had given her years ago that she had taken completely to heart. Know your material so well that the slides become optional. The marketing director, her name was Carla, was attentive and still, which Isabel could not entirely read. Her deputy took notes. There were no interruptions for the first 15 minutes, which was good. The questions came at the end. They were detailed, probing questions about timelines and deliverables and contingencies. Isabel answered them without hedging, and when she didn't know an exact figure, she said so and committed to sending it by close of business. She had learned, through painful earlier experience, that inventing answers was always worse than admitting uncertainty. Afterwards, in the lift, Raj said, "That went well." "You think?" Isabel said. Carla uncrossed her arms at minute 12, Raj said. "I counted." Isabel looked at him. "You counted when she uncrossed her arms?" "Body language," Raj said. "It's information." 2 days later, Carla called to say they had won the contract. Isabel called Raj first, before anyone else. "Minute 12, he said when he picked up. "Minute 12, she agreed. Story 4. Night shift. The hospital at night was a different place. Gabriel had been working night shifts in the pharmacy department for 2 years, and he still felt, sometimes, the slight unreality of it. The sense that the building he walked into at 10 in the evening was not quite the same building that the day staff worked in. The corridors were quieter, the pace was different, there was more darkness outside the windows and more silence in the spaces between tasks. He liked it. He had been surprised to find this out about himself. Before he started nights, he had expected to hate them, to struggle with the hours, the disruption to his sleep, the social isolation of working while the rest of the world slept. And for the first month, these things had indeed been hard. He had been tired in strange, non-linear ways. He had attended a friend's birthday dinner and fallen asleep sitting upright in his chair between the starter and the main course. But he had adjusted. The body was adaptable, and the nights themselves turned out to have compensations he hadn't anticipated. There was, for one thing, a particular focus that came from working in a quiet building. During the day, there was background noise, the constant buzz of activity, the movement of people, the beeping of various machines, the general sense of a large institution going about its business. At night, all of that fell away, and what remained was the work itself. He mixed medications, checked prescriptions, prepared ward orders. Each task had his full attention. There was also, he had found, a different quality to the interactions. The staff who worked nights tended to know each other well. There were fewer of them, and they worked in closer proximity. During one of his early shifts, a nurse from the surgical ward had come down at 3 in the morning with a query about a patient's dosage. He had resolved the query, and then they had stood in the corridor for 20 minutes talking about entirely unrelated things. He could not imagine this happening at 2 in the afternoon. Tonight was a Thursday, 2 in the morning. The building was still. Outside, rain fell against the windows. Gabriel was at his workstation, double-checking a medication list against a patient file. His colleagues were elsewhere in the department. He could hear them moving, the soft sounds of their work. He liked this, he thought, the quiet, the rain, the particular concentration required for careful work in the small hours. It was not glamorous and not exciting and not the life he had imagined when he was younger and thinking about what his career would look like. But it was his, and it was good, and he did it well. He turned back to the medication list. There was a discrepancy in the dosage, small but definite. He noted it, flagged it, and reached for the phone. The work was always worth doing carefully. Story 5. The interview. Diane had interviewed for 47 jobs since graduating. She knew this because she kept a spreadsheet. Column A, company name. Column B, role. Column C, will, date. Column D, outcome. Column D was mostly variations of the same words. Unsuccessful. Not proceeding. We have decided to move forward with another candidate, after careful consideration. The language of rejection was remarkably consistent. It did not vary much between industries or types of company. Whoever had invented these phrases had been very thorough. She had started keeping the spreadsheet after the 8th rejection, when she realized she was beginning to lose track of where she had applied. It had seemed sensible at the time. By the time she reached 20, it had become a different kind of thing, a record, a proof that she had not given up. Today's interview was for a project coordinator role at an engineering firm. She had applied on a Tuesday and been called for interview by Friday, which was fast and felt like a good sign. The recruiter had been warm on the phone. The job description, when she reread it the night before, seemed genuinely suited to her experience. She had allowed herself, cautiously, to be hopeful. She arrived 10 minutes early, checked in at reception, and sat in a comfortable chair in a bright lobby. She breathed steadily. She had read once that the most effective pre-interview technique was simply to breathe slowly and think about a moment when you had felt competent. She thought about the project she had managed at her last role, the one that had gone over budget and behind schedule and which she had pulled back, through a combination of difficult conversations and relentless follow-up, to deliver on time. That had been hard. She had done it. She felt slightly better. The interviewer was a woman named Helen who apologized for being 2 minutes late and immediately put Diane at ease with a joke about the coffee machine in the kitchen. The interview was conversational, not interrogative. Helen asked her about her experience, listened genuinely to the answers, and asked follow-up questions that suggested she had actually processed what Diane said, rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. Afterwards, shaking hands at the lift, Helen said, "We're moving quickly on this one. You should hear from us by end of next week." Diane said thank you and stepped into the lift and rode it down to the ground floor. On the train home, she opened her spreadsheet and added the row. Column A, Hartfield Engineering. Column B, Project Coordinator. Column C, today's date. Column D, she left blank for now. She closed the laptop and looked out the train window. She thought she had done well. She was not certain. She was never certain. But she had answered the questions honestly and specifically, and she had asked good questions of her own, and she had not pretended to know things she didn't know. That, she had come to believe, was the best you could do. Column D filled itself in the following Tuesday. Offer. She stared at the word for a long time before she believed it. Story 6. The Small Business. The bakery opened on a Thursday in March. Roberta had spent 14 months preparing for this. She had worked evenings and weekends while keeping her office job, developing recipes, attending a small business course at the local college, meeting with her bank, finding the premises, negotiating the lease, sourcing equipment, applying for licenses. She had made spreadsheets of costs that frightened her, and then remade them with different assumptions until they frightened her slightly less. Her partner Leon had supported all of this with consistent, patient belief. He had listened to her describe the same problem 4 times on 4 different evenings and responded each time as if it were new information, which she recognized as a form of love. She had also sought advice from anyone who would give it. She had emailed a woman who ran a bakery in the next town, a complete stranger, and asked if she would be willing to have a coffee and share her experience. The woman, whose name was Bet, had said yes, and they had spent 2 hours in the back of Bet's own bakery on a Tuesday morning, while loaves cooled on the racks behind them, talking through everything from pricing to staffing to what to do when the oven breaks on a Saturday morning. "It will break," Bet said. "Plan for it." "When?" Roberta asked. "The worst possible time," Bet said, smiling grimly. "That's just how it is." Thursday morning arrived. Roberta had been at the bakery since 4 when the first loaves went in. The shelves were full by the time she unlocked the door at 8. Sourdough loaves, seeded rye, a tray of croissants, 2 types of muffin, a coffee cake, and a dozen individual pastries that she had decided to call morning buns, and which were her own invention, enriched dough, cardamom, a little orange zest. The first customer arrived at 4 minutes past 8. An older man with a newspaper under his arm who asked for a sourdough loaf and a croissant looked around the shop while she bagged his bread and said, "This is new. How long have you been here?" "About 4 minutes," she said. He laughed. "Well, good start." By noon she had sold out of croissants, nearly all of the morning buns, and more sourdough than she had expected. She had also run out of paper bags at 11, which she solved by sending Leon, who had taken the day off to help, to the office supply shop 2 streets away for carrier bags. At the end of the day, when the last customer had left and she had cleaned down the counters and put the remaining bread in the markdown bin, she sat on a stool in the kitchen and looked at the empty shelves. She was tired in a way that went all the way through her. Her feet ached. There was flour on her face, which she discovered only when she looked in the small mirror in the back room. She had eaten only half a muffin and a cup of coffee since 5 in the morning. Leon came in from the front of the shop with 2 mugs of tea and sat on the other stool. "Well," he said. She looked around the kitchen, at the ovens, which were hers, the shelves, which were hers, the window she had hung the small sign in, which said the name she had chosen after months of uncertainty, Steady Rise. "Good start," she said. Story 7, The Mentor. The first time Priya met her mentor, she thought she had the wrong room. The woman sitting at the table in the small meeting room was perhaps 65, with cropped white hair and the kind of unhurried manner that made Priya feel, somehow, that she was the one who was late, even though she was 2 minutes early. She was reading something on her phone and did not look up immediately. "Miss Okafor?" Priya said from the doorway. The woman looked up. Her eyes were sharp and warm at the same time. "Priya?" "Yes." "Hi. Sorry. I wasn't sure I had the right." "You did. Sit down." She put her phone away and folded her hands on the table. "Tell me about yourself." This was not what Priya had expected. She had prepared questions. She had a list of things she wanted to ask, about navigating senior leadership, about the gap between middle management and executive roles, about how to make herself visible in the right ways. She had prepared to receive advice. She had not prepared to give information. She sat down and began. She told Miss Okafor, who said after 2 minutes, "Call me Ruth," about her career. 6 years in operations, 2 promotions, her current role as operations manager for a logistics company where she was, she admitted, beginning to feel stuck. Ruth listened without interruption. When Priya finished, she was quiet for a moment. "What does stuck feel like?" she asked. Priya thought about it. "Like I'm very good at my current job," she said slowly, "and I know it, and everyone around me knows it, and somehow that's become the ceiling instead of the floor." Ruth nodded slowly. "You're too comfortable," she said, "and comfortable is a trap." "I don't feel comfortable," Priya said. "I feel frustrated." "That's different," Ruth said. "Comfortable people don't notice the trap. Frustrated people do. The fact that you're frustrated means you're not stuck, you're ready." This was not what Priya had expected to hear, and she turned it over in her mind for the rest of the meeting. They met 6 more times over the next year. Ruth never gave simple answers, which sometimes irritated Priya and always, eventually, proved right. She asked questions that made Priya work out her own answers. She gave advice that was specific and practical, drawn from her own decades in corporate leadership, offered without sentiment. And she told Priya one thing at their final meeting that Priya carried with her for years afterwards. The people who get stuck permanently are the people who confuse being good at something with having found their place. You are good at your job. That is not the same as your job being good for you. Priya thought about this on the train home. She was good at her job. Was her job good for her? She already knew the answer. She had known it for a while. Hearing it said out loud, in someone else's clear, unhurried voice, just made it harder to ignore. Story 8. The Deadline. The article was due at 9 in the morning. It was now 20 past 2. Felix sat at his desk with an almost empty coffee cup and a document containing 700 words out of the required 2,000, and a feeling in his chest that he recognized as a specific, familiar kind of desperation that appeared only when a deadline was very close and the work was very not done. He had written himself into a corner. He had started with an argument that had seemed good in the afternoon. Clear, surprising, well-supported, and somewhere around the 800-word mark had realized that the evidence did not actually support it. It supported a slightly different argument, a better argument, probably, but a different one, which meant starting again. He did not start again. He saved the document under a new name, opened a blank page, and wrote the new argument from the top. This was something he had learned, not quickly and not without pain, about his own writing process. He wasted time trying to fix things that were fundamentally broken. It was faster and less miserable to admit the failure and begin fresh. The second version always benefited from everything he had worked out in the first. He wrote, "The apartment was quiet. Outside, a city that was mostly asleep, punctuated by the occasional car or the distant sound of something that might have been music. He drank the remaining cold coffee from the cup and did not notice it was cold. By 3:45, he had 1,000 words. By 5, he had the full 2,000, rough but complete. He read it back, made corrections, cut a paragraph that he liked but that was not necessary, and added a sentence to the conclusion that felt, when he wrote it, like the thing he had actually been trying to say all along. He submitted it at 6:15 in the morning. He set an alarm for 9, lay down on the sofa with his shoes on, and was asleep in approximately 4 minutes. His editor responded at 9:17. "This is really good. Great argument. Well done." Felix did not read this message until 11, when he woke up with lines from the sofa cushion on his face and a stiff neck and the slightly bewildered feeling of someone who has slept somewhere unexpected. He read the message twice. Then he stood up, went to the kitchen, and made proper coffee, freshly ground in the cafetiere, properly done, and drank it standing at the window watching the street below. It had been worth it. It was always worth it. He could never remember this during the difficult hours, but it was always true afterwards. Story 9. The Career Change. At 41, Miriam left her career in finance. This took longer to say than to explain, but not by much. She had worked in financial services for 16 years, she was good at it, she was well paid for it, and one morning in November she woke up and knew, with the clarity that sometimes arrived in the early hours, that she did not want to do it anymore. She did not make the decision that morning. She was a careful person. She spent 6 months examining the feeling from every angle, waiting to see if it would change. It didn't. She had been making pottery on weekends for 3 years. She had taken a class, the way people took classes on weekends, a leisure activity, a hobby, something that was definitionally separate from real life. But she had found in the studio a quality of attention and satisfaction that she had not felt at work in a long time. She did not think about anything else when her hands were in the clay. Time moved differently, problems dissolved. She told no one what she was thinking, except her sister Clara, who did not laugh and asked what the plan was. The plan evolved over the following months. She found a studio where she could rent time. She built up a body of work, bowls, vases, small sculptural pieces that she didn't have names for. She entered a few pieces in a local craft exhibition, sold 2, and received an inquiry from a small shop that sold handmade goods about stocking her work. She did the mathematics many times. She consulted a financial advisor. She saved. At the end of April of the following year, she handed in her notice. Her colleagues were surprised. Some were encouraging. One, a man she had worked with for 8 years, said, "I didn't know you made pots." "I didn't used to," she said. The first year was financially difficult. She had expected this and planned for it. There were months when she doubted herself, which she had also expected and which she managed as best she could, by working, mostly, by going to the studio and making things, rather than sitting at home, thinking about whether she had made a mistake. The second year was better. A gallery in the city took on her work. An online shop began selling her pieces. She was invited to demonstrate at a craft fair, which she found terrifying and did anyway. She did not become wealthy. She had not expected to. She became something else. She did not have a precise word for it. Something to do with being in the right place in her own life, with doing the thing she was actually here to do, rather than the thing she had defaulted into and stayed in through inertia and reasonable salary and the deep human reluctance to change what is working well enough. It was not easy. She had not thought it would be. It was worth it. She had hoped this would be true, and it was. Answer. Story 10. The Project. The project had been running for 8 months when things started to go wrong. Theo had been managing it from the beginning, a system upgrade for a large non-profit organization, replacing aging software with something modern and integrated. He had managed projects before. He knew how they went. He had built in contingency time and contingency budget and had fully expected both to be used. He had not expected the data migration to fail 3 times in a row. The first failure was a technical problem, a compatibility issue between the old system and the new one that the development team identified and fixed within a week. The second failure was a data quality issue, inconsistencies in the old records that had to be cleaned before the migration could proceed. The third failure was, honestly, human error. Someone on the technical team made an incorrect assumption and did not check it. Theo handled this conversation carefully and without anger, which cost him some effort, but he judged it necessary. Each failure pushed the timeline. The client, a patient, reasonable woman named Dr. Anand, was informed at each point, clearly and promptly. Theo had learned early in his career that bad news delivered promptly was almost always better received than bad news delivered late. It did not make the news less bad, it made the relationship more solid. By month 8, they were 6 weeks behind schedule. The budget was not yet over, but it was close to the edge. Theo held a project meeting, laid out the exact situation without softening, and asked the team to identify the fastest path to completion that did not create new risks. The team came through. There was a revised plan on the table by the following morning. The system went live on a Tuesday in February, 11 weeks after the original planned date. Dr. Anand attended the go-live meeting, watched the first users log in successfully, and shook Theo's hand at the end. "It's been a hard project," she said. "It has," he agreed. "But you kept us informed," she said. "The whole way. I never felt like things were happening that I didn't know about. That matters." He thought about this on the drive home. He had managed the communication carefully, and he knew that, but hearing it acknowledged felt different from knowing it abstractly. It made concrete something he had held as a principle but sometimes doubted in the difficult months. That transparency, even when the news is bad, builds something that cannot be built any other way. He got home, made dinner, and did not think about work for the rest of the evening. It was, he thought, allowed. Story 11. The Craft. Ingrid had been a watchmaker for 32 years. People found this remarkable. They would hear what she did and their expression would change. A widening of the eyes, a slight tilt of the head, and they would say something like, "Really?" or "That still exists?" as if watchmakers were like milkmen or lamplighters, professions that had slipped quietly out of the modern world. They existed. She was one. She had a workshop in the back of a small shop in a market town, accessible through a door in the wall that many people walked past without noticing, and she repaired and serviced mechanical watches from morning to evening, 5 days a week. The work required exceptional precision and exceptional patience in roughly equal measure. Mechanical watches contain dozens, sometimes hundreds of components. Tiny wheels and springs and jewels and levers, each one performing a specific and irreplaceable function. To service a watch properly, you disassembled it completely, cleaned every part individually, examined each component for wear or damage, replaced what needed replacing, lubricated the pivots with oils that came in quantities so small they were measured in microliters, and reassembled everything in the correct sequence. This process took time. Depending on the watch, a service might take 2 hours or 2 days. There was no shortcut that did not eventually announce itself in a watch that did not run properly. Ingrid had never been tempted by shortcuts. This was partly character and partly a kind of professional pride that had been instilled in her by the man she had apprenticed with, who had told her once, "The watch doesn't care about your deadline. It runs when it's right and stops when it's wrong. You cannot argue with it." This had struck her as one of the most sensible things she had ever heard. People brought her watches of enormous sentimental value, a grandfather's pocket watch, a wedding gift, a piece bought decades ago and worn every day. They brought them with anxiety and stories. She received these things with care. She knew that the object on her bench was not just a timekeeping instrument, it was memory and continuity and love. She repaired them carefully. She always had. She always would. One afternoon, a young woman brought in a watch that had belonged to her mother, who had died the previous year. The watch had stopped, and the young woman's voice, as she handed it over, was careful in a way that people's voices became when they were managing sadness. "I'll look after it," Ingrid said simply. She did. She spent the better part of a day on it, longer than she needed to probably, but she didn't count the time carefully for jobs like this. The watch had a small fault in the escapement, which she corrected. She cleaned it and oiled it and reassembled it and wound it and set it running on her timing machine. It ran perfectly. When the young woman came to collect it, Ingrid showed her the timing results on the screen. The watch was running slightly fast, well within acceptable range. "It's keeping good time," Ingrid said. The young woman looked at the watch running on the screen. "She wore it every day," she said. "I know," Ingrid said. "I can tell. The case is worn in the right places." The young woman looked up at her. "The right places?" "The places where it was held and touched and carried," Ingrid said. "That kind of wear is different from neglect. A watch that's been worn every day looks different from one that's been kept in a drawer." The young woman was quiet for a moment. Then she paid and picked up the watch and held it in both hands for a second before putting it on her wrist. She fastened the clasp. "Thank you," she said. "Take care of it," Ingrid said. "It'll take care of you." Story 12. The Lesson. On the last day before the school summer holidays, Caroline's class gave her a card. It was not unusual. Teachers received cards. It was a ritual of the school year, the giving and receiving of cards and small gifts at Christmas and in July. Caroline had received many over her 11 years of teaching. She thanked each one warmly and meant it. But this card was different. Not the card itself. It was the usual oversized card from a stationery shop. On the front, a drawing of a rainbow and the words "Thank you" in large, cheerful letters. What was different was inside. Each of the 26 students in the class had written something, not just their name, something specific, something they had learned or remembered or wanted to say. She read them in her classroom after the children had gone, sitting at her desk in the quietness of the empty room. "You taught me that it's okay to get things wrong as long as you try again. Amelie, I wasn't good at reading when I came to your class. Now I am. Jerome, you remembered that I liked dinosaurs and you put a dinosaur in our maths worksheet. Noah, I used to be scared to answer questions in case I was wrong. I'm not scared anymore. Fatima, you made me feel like I was good at something when I didn't think I was good at anything. Marcus." She read them all. She sat at her desk for a long time afterwards, in the silent classroom, the windows open to the warm July afternoon. Teaching was a profession that gave you very little immediate feedback on whether you were doing it well. Unlike some jobs, where the results were measurable and visible, teaching operated largely on faith. Faith that the work you were putting in now was having an effect that might not be visible for years. You planted things. You could not always see what grew. Moments like this were rare and therefore precious. They were the proof that something had been growing that you could not see. She put the card carefully in her bag. She would take it home and put it somewhere she could find it on the days when teaching was hard, which it was, often, and would continue to be. On those days, she would read the messages again. You made me feel like I was good at something when I didn't think I was good at anything." She thought about Marcus, a quiet, serious boy who had struggled in September with confidence more than with any specific subject. She thought about the slow process of the year, the small moments, the patience required on both sides. She picked up her bag, turned off the classroom light, and walked down the corridor towards the summer. Story 9. The promotion she didn't get. She had not been promoted when she had expected to be, and the not getting had taught her more than the getting would have. She had been confident she would get it. She had done the work, exceeded the expectations, been told, in the way of vague corporate encouragement, that she was on the right track. The right track had not led to the promotion that cycle, and the person who had received it for reasons that, on inspection, were legitimate. She had been disappointed and then had spent time with the disappointment productively. She had asked her manager directly what had determined the decision. She had received a clear answer. The answer had pointed to a specific gap between her contribution and what the role required, which was a gap she had not identified and which the disappointment had made visible. She had addressed the gap. She had been promoted the following cycle. She thought often about what the first non-promotion had given her that the first cycle promotion would not have. The specific feedback, the accurate picture of the gap, the motivation to address it precisely rather than continuing in the direction she had already been going. She had needed to not get it, to be able to get it. Story 10. The Mentor. She had had a mentor for 3 years, which had been the most professionally useful relationship she had had. The mentor was someone she had asked directly, which had been, in itself, a useful practice in asking for what you needed. The person had said yes, and they had met 4 times a year, and the meetings had been different from every other professional relationship she had, because the mentor had no stake in her decisions, and therefore could be genuinely honest about them. The mentor's honesty had been the point. Everyone else in her professional life had some investment in what she did. Her manager needed certain outcomes. Her colleagues were affected by her choices. Her organization had its own interests. The mentor had none of these. The mentor simply looked at what she brought and said what they thought. She had found, in the clarity of this, that she could hear things she could not hear from other sources. Feedback delivered without investment had a quality that invested feedback did not. She had used it. She had eventually become a mentor herself, for someone younger. She had tried to offer the same quality, honest, invested in the person rather than the outcome, available to say the things that others with stakes could not. Story 11. The Project That Failed. He had led a project that had failed, and the failure had been public and had been attributed to his decisions, and he had had to find a way to continue. The failure had been real. He did not minimize it. He had made decisions that he had believed in at the time and that had turned out to be wrong, and the wrongness had been visible and had cost people things. He had had to sit with this. He had found his way through it by doing 3 things. He had acknowledged the failure specifically, not generally, not hedged, but with the specific decisions named and their consequences owned. He had identified what he would do differently. He had then continued. The continuing had been the hardest part. The failure was a large object in his professional self-image, and it took time for other things to become visible around it. He had kept working. He had worked with more caution and also with more honesty. He had become someone who was willing to say what he didn't know, which the failure had cured him of the habit of concealing. He had been trusted with significant work again. He had done it differently. He thought the failure had made him a better leader in the specific ways that failure made people better at things, which was uncomfortably but genuinely true. Story 12. The work she loved. She had found, in her mid-30s, work she actually loved, and the finding had changed her relationship with the rest of her life. She had not always had it. She had had work she was good at, and work she found tolerable, and work that had paid the bills, and work that had been interesting without being loved. The loved work was different from all of these. The difference was in the quality of engagement. She worked on the things she loved with a focus she could not manufacture for other things. A focus that was not effort exactly, but something closer to absorption. The time moved differently. She came away from the work energized rather than depleted. She thought about what had produced it. She had not planned to find it. She had followed a series of interests without knowing they would lead here, and had arrived here as a result of movement rather than strategy. She had been attentive to what interested her. She had kept moving toward it. She was not certain the loved work was the right framework for everyone. She knew people who found meaning outside their work and had excellent and full lives. But for her, having found the work she loved had mattered, and she was grateful for it and tried to protect it. Story 13. The boundary. She had learned to set boundaries at work through the specific experience of not having them for several years and observing the results. The not having had seemed, at the time, like dedication. She was available. She responded to things quickly. She said yes to requests. She treated the work as the priority, and the other things, her rest, her time, her other responsibilities, as the things that fitted around the work. The results had accumulated slowly, and then arrived all at once in the form of a period of exhaustion that was not manageable without significant change. She had made the change not because she wanted to, but because she had run out of the resources the previous arrangement required. The change was, she defined what the work required and did that, and she protected the rest. She responded to emails in working hours. She went home at the time she said she would go home. She said no to things that were not the work she was there to do. She had expected the work to suffer. It had not suffered. She had, if anything, done the important things better for having more capacity for them. The not suffering had been instructive. The availability had not been producing the outcomes she had attributed to it. Story 14. The colleague. He had worked with a colleague for 8 years who had been the best professional relationship he had had, and he had learned from it what to look for in future professional relationships. The colleague had been honest, in the specific way of telling him when she disagreed with his judgment, rather than agreeing for the sake of the relationship. She had been generous with information, not protecting knowledge in the way some people protected knowledge as a form of professional power. She had been reliable in the basic sense. She did what she said she would do. He had not appreciated all of these qualities at once. He had appreciated the honesty first, because it had been immediately useful. He had appreciated the generosity over time, as he saw what it produced. He had come to understand the reliability as the ground of all the rest. Without it, the other things could not have been trusted. When the colleague had moved to a different organization, he had missed the professional relationship in a way he had not expected. He had had to find versions of what she offered, individually, in different people. He had not found the combination in one person again, which told him something about how rare it was. Story 15. The career change. She had changed careers at 41, which had been frightening in the months before, and which had been the right decision. The fear had been real. She had been good at the first career. She had built things in it over 16 years. A reputation, a network, a set of skills that had real value. Leaving had felt like abandoning things she had worked to build. She had left because the first career had stopped giving her what it had given her in the early years. The work had become routine in a way she could not resolve from within it. She had tried. The new projects, the different roles, the expanded responsibilities. The routine had persisted. The new career had involved a period of not being good yet, which was one of the costs she had been afraid of. She had been a beginner, competent in some things and not yet competent in others, learning in front of people who knew more. This had been uncomfortable. She was, several years later, good at the new career and not bored by it. The things she had built in the first career had not been abandoned. They had followed her, in the form of skills that were transferable and a network that remained. She had not left everything. She had changed what she was building. Story 16. The ambition she let go. She had wanted, for most of her 20s and early 30s, to reach a particular position, to be at a particular level, to have a particular title, to be understood as having achieved a certain thing. She had let this go in her late 30s, not because she had given up, but because the ambition had stopped being interesting. The position itself, what it would actually contain, had become more important than what it would be called. The letting go had been a relief she had not anticipated. The position ambition had carried with it a quality of performance, the ongoing assessment of whether she was ahead or behind some imagined trajectory, the self-consciousness of the achieving. The letting go had replaced this with a simpler question. Is the work good? Is it worth doing? She had found that this question was easier to answer and produced better work. The work she had done while trying to achieve a position had been colored by the trying. The work she did once she had stopped performing the achievement was cleaner. She had still achieved things, but they had come as outcomes of good work rather than as the purpose of it, and she found, in the achieving them that way, that they meant more. Story 17. The Difficult Manager. He had worked for a difficult manager for 2 years, and he had found ways to manage the situation that he had used in other contexts since. The difficult manager was not malicious. He was simply poorly suited to management. He took credit in ways that stung, withheld information that would have been useful to share, gave feedback rarely and unhelpfully when he did. These were not exceptional failings. They were the common failings of people who had been promoted into management without preparation. He had managed the situation by managing himself, understanding that the validation he needed would not come from this manager and finding it elsewhere, in the work itself, in the relationships with colleagues, in external acknowledgement that the manager's style made internal acknowledgement difficult to come by. He had also learned to manage the information problem. He had built relationships that meant the information came to him through channels other than the manager. He had kept records of his own contributions, for himself if not for immediate use. He had not enjoyed the 2 years. He had learned things he used for the rest of his career. He had eventually moved to a different manager. The moving had been the right decision, made only slightly later than it should have been. Story 18. The Work That Sustained. She had asked herself, at various points in her career, what made the difference between work that sustained her and work that depleted her. The answer she had arrived at was not about the content, the type of work, the industry, the subject matter. It was about conditions. The work she found most sustainable was work in which she had meaningful autonomy, in which she could see the effect of what she was doing, and in which the people around her were people she respected. The content varied. She had found sustainable work in very different kinds of work. She had found depleting work across the same range. The conditions, not the content, seemed to determine it. She had used this understanding when evaluating new opportunities. She had asked about the autonomy and the feedback loops and the people. She had asked more carefully than she had been willing to ask earlier in her career, when she had been more afraid of the asking and more focused on the title and the salary. The conditions she needed were not exotic. They were, she thought, what most people needed. The workplaces that provided them retained people. The ones that did not turned over constantly. This seemed like important information. Story 19. The recognition. She had received public recognition for a piece of work she had done, and the recognition had been gratifying and had also revealed something to her about herself. The gratification had been genuine and immediate. She had worked hard on the thing, and the acknowledgement of the work had felt good in the way that acknowledgement of effort felt good. She had accepted it gracefully. What it revealed came later. She had found, in the week after the recognition, that she was waiting for more of it. The single recognition had not satisfied. It had activated an appetite she had not known she had. She had watched herself looking for signs of further acknowledgement and had found this information interesting. She had thought about what she was looking for and had identified that she was using external recognition as confirmation that the work had been good, and that she did not yet fully trust her own assessment of when her work was good. The recognition had stood in for her own judgment. She had worked on developing the internal measure. She was still working on it. She had found that the recognition was better received when she already knew the work was good and the recognition confirmed it, rather than when the recognition was the first notification that the work was good. The difference was significant, and she was trying to make it the normal case. Story 20. The industry that changed. He had been in an industry for 20 years that had changed significantly in the final 10, and navigating the change had been the most demanding professional challenge he had faced. The early years of the industry had been stable in a way he had not known to appreciate. The skills he had built had a long lifespan. The knowledge had remained current for years before requiring updating. He had developed expertise, and the expertise had remained valuable. The change had arrived and had required him to develop in ways that felt, at first, like starting over. They were not starting over. The foundational things remained, but they felt that way because the surface of the work had changed so much that the expertise was not immediately visible. He had navigated by focusing on what had not changed: the judgment, the communication, the relationships, the understanding of what problems actually needed to be solved. These things remained applicable even when the tools and methods were new. He had learned the new tools. He had trusted the old judgment to tell him how to use them. He was still in the industry. He was still good at it. He was also different from the person who had entered it, which was probably correct. Story 21. The question she always asked. She had developed, over the years of her career, a question she asked herself when making significant professional decisions. What will this teach me? Not, will I be good at it? Not, will it pay well? Not, does it have good prospects? These were all useful questions, but they were not the question she had found most useful. What will this teach me had a specific logic. It privileged the development over the outcome. It assumed that what she was building over a career was not a set of achievements, but a set of capabilities, and that the capabilities were built through experience, and that the most valuable experiences were the ones that taught her things she did not already know. She had taken roles that were below her previous level because they would teach her something. She had stayed in difficult situations because they were teaching her things the comfortable situations had not. She had moved toward challenges rather than away from them, partly because of the question. She did not always get the learning right. Sometimes she had expected to learn one thing and had learned another. Sometimes she had not learned as much as the situation seemed to promise. But on balance, the question had oriented her toward growth, which was where she found the work most alive. Story 22. The Slow Progress. She had been working toward something for 4 years, and the progress had been slow enough that she sometimes could not see it, and she had found ways to keep going anyway. The thing she was working toward was a qualification, significant and requiring, and the years of working toward it had taken place alongside a full professional life, which had made every year of it harder than it would have been in different circumstances. She had had less time than she needed, and had used the time she had, consistently, for 4 years. The slowness had been difficult to maintain. She had had periods of doubt, not about whether to continue, which she had settled, but about whether the pace was adequate, whether what she was doing was being retained, whether the years of part-time effort were going to be sufficient. She had found her way through the doubt by focusing on the next unit rather than the overall thing. The overall thing was very large and the time was very long, and looking at the full scale was not useful. The next unit was manageable, and she could do the next unit, and she had done the next unit for 4 years. She had qualified. She was glad she had continued. She was also glad it was done. Story 23. What ambition was for. She had thought about ambition for most of her working life, and had arrived, eventually, at an understanding of it that she found useful. Ambition, she had decided, was not about reaching a particular place. It was about the direction of travel, the commitment to moving toward something, to growing, to not staying where you were simply because where you were was safe. This definition allowed ambition to be applied to many things, not only the conventional career markers. She could be ambitious about her expertise. She could be ambitious about how she led people. She could be ambitious about the quality of the work itself, which was the ambition she had come to find most sustaining. The conventional ambition, the title, the salary, the status, was real, and she was not against it. She had wanted those things and had worked for them, but she had found that they were satisfying as outcomes of doing good work, and unsatisfying as ends in themselves. When she aimed for them directly, they felt hollow. When they arrived as consequences of work she had cared about, they felt earned. She had tried to aim at the work. The work had, over time, produced most of what she had wanted. Story 24. The Last Story. He had worked for more than 30 years and had found, in the final decade of that, a perspective on it that the early decades had not given him. Work was a significant portion of a life. He had spent a very large number of hours in it and had made choices that had shaped the character of those hours, and the character of the hours had shaped the character of the life more broadly. This seemed important to name. He had not always made the right choices. He had stayed too long in some places and left too soon in others. He had prioritized the wrong things in periods and the right things in other periods. He had wasted some years and used some years very well. What he had found, looking back from the final decade, was that the work that had mattered was always the work he had done with full engagement, the work he had cared about, the problems he had wanted to solve, the people he had been glad to be with. The other work had filled time and been paid and had left fewer traces. He wanted, in the remaining years, to do more of the work that left traces. He had enough experience now to know what that looked like. He was trying to choose it, more deliberately than he had always managed, while there was still time to choose. Story 25. The Colleague Who Left. He had worked with someone for 5 years and she had left the organization, and the leaving had shown him things about the work he had not fully seen while she was there. The things she had done had become visible in their absence. The functions she had quietly performed, the relationships she had maintained that had made things run, the particular quality of her attention to the people around her, these had not been invisible exactly, but they had been background, and the background became visible when it was removed. He had understood, after she left, that significant portions of the work he thought of as the work had been the relationships. The task was the surface. The relationships were what made the task possible. He had been attending to the surface. He had tried, after this, to attend more to the relationships, to be more deliberate about the people, to notice the functions that were being performed quietly, and to name them, to not let them be background while they were present. He had also tried to tell people when their work was valuable, because he had not told her enough, and she had left, and he had found himself regretting the not telling. Story 26. The Offer She Turned Down. She had turned down a significant offer, the kind that looked, from the outside, like the obvious right move, and had been right to turn it down. The offer had been impressive: better title, significantly more money, larger scope. She had wanted for a moment to say yes immediately because the offer felt like validation, and the validation had been appealing. She had waited before answering. She had done the asking she had learned to do about the team, the culture, the decisions she would have and not have, the specific problems she would be working on. The answers to the questions had not been what she had hoped. She had turned it down. The people she had consulted had had mixed opinions. Some had been surprised. Some had agreed with her reasoning. She had gone back to the work she was already doing. She had been right, and she knew she had been right not because things had necessarily gone badly at the other place, but because the things she had asked about had remained matters of concern, visible from the outside in the months after she declined. She had seen enough to know the questions had been the right questions. She was glad she had waited before answering. She was glad she had asked. Story 27. The Portfolio. She had maintained a record of her work across the years, a portfolio loosely of things she had made and decisions she had been involved in and problems she had solved, and she had found it useful in ways she had not anticipated when she started. She had started it for practical reasons: the job application, the performance review, the record of what she had done. She had continued it because it had become a useful document for herself, not only for external purposes. Reading back through it gave her a version of her career she did not have access to otherwise: the through line, the progression, the things she had worked on that she had forgotten. She had done more, and done it better in some ways, than the daily experience of the work had suggested. The portfolio was evidence against the low-grade imposterism that could, without evidence, seem reasonable. She had also found it useful for identifying the things that appeared repeatedly, the kinds of problems that came to her, the aspects of the work she was always chosen for, the pattern of the career, which was not always visible from inside it, was visible in the record. She recommended the keeping of it to everyone who would listen. Story 28. The Energy Question. He had found, in his late 30s, that the most important question he could ask about any professional commitment was not about money or title, but about energy. Does this give me energy or take it? When he finished the work, Was he more depleted than when he started? Or was there something that remained? Not physical energy exactly, but the particular aliveness of having done something that mattered to him. He had found, using this question over several years, that the answer was specific and reliable. Certain kinds of work consistently gave energy, others consistently took it. He had not previously trusted this information enough to act on it. He had treated the energy question as secondary to the practical questions of salary and advancement. He had started to treat it as primary. Not the only thing. The practical questions remained real, but the energy question, answered honestly, told him things about the work that he could not know from the other information. It told him whether he could sustain the work over time. It told him whether the work was the right work for him. He had moved toward what gave energy and away from what didn't. He was doing this imperfectly, and it was still substantially true. He was less depleted than he had been. Story 29. The smaller scope. She had, at a certain point in her career, voluntarily reduced her scope, taken on less, led fewer things, given up responsibilities she had spent years accumulating, and it had been the right thing, and had taken her years to feel sure of it. The reduction had come because the accumulated scope was too much. She had built toward it over a decade, and had arrived at a position where she was doing many things and doing none of them as well as she would have wanted. She had not been willing to acknowledge this while she was inside it. She had reduced, she had heard, from some people, this described as stepping back, which had stung in the way that accurate descriptions sometimes sting when they contain a valuation you are not sure you share. She had thought, is this stepping back? Is stepping back bad? She had concluded she was doing less and doing it better, and what she was doing was what she wanted to do. The title was smaller, the scope was smaller, the quality of the engagement was higher. She was less depleted. She had made the right trade. She thought there was not enough room in professional culture for this choice. The direction of ambition was always assumed to be upward and outward. She had found that sideways, or even inward, could be more sustaining. She was glad she had trusted the finding. Story 30. The craft. He had come to think of his work as a craft, which had changed his relationship with it. The craft framework meant the work was something that could be done better or worse, that improved with practice and attention, that had standards that were worth caring about, that could be taken seriously as a thing in itself rather than as a means to something else. He had found this framing more sustaining than the achievement framing he had previously used. The achievement framing located the value in the outcome, the completed project, the reached goal, the external recognition. The craft framing located the value in the doing, the quality of the work, the improvement, the care taken. The craft framework also made failure less catastrophic. A failed project, in the achievement framework, was a failed thing. In the craft framework, it was a difficult piece of learning, something that had shown him things he had not known, that had contributed to the development of the craft even in not working. He did not think the craft framework was the only useful framework. Achievement was real and motivated him. But the craft underneath the achievement was what he returned to on the days when achievement felt distant. Story 31. The rest. She had not taken the rest when she needed it, for years, and the not taking had accumulated costs she had eventually had to pay. She had believed, as she had believed many things about work in her younger professional life, that rest was what happened when the work was done, and that the work was never done, and therefore rest was something she got to in the gaps or not at all. She had valued the appearance of industry. She had been suspicious of people who seemed to rest easily. The costs had been the usual ones: the diminishing quality of the work when she was too tired to do it well, the irritability, the reduced judgment, the creativity that was not available when the mind was always occupied. She had learned to rest deliberately. This had required the same kind of scheduling and protection she gave to the important work, because it was important work, the kind that made the other work possible. She was better at the work when she rested. This seemed obvious stated plainly. It had not been obvious when she was inside the culture that treated rest as a departure from seriousness. She wished she had learned it sooner. Story 32. What work was. She had asked herself, at various points, what work was for, and she had given herself different answers at different times. At the beginning it was for money, which was true and necessary and not nothing. Later it was for belonging, the having of a place to go and people to be with and a role in something larger. This too was true. Later still it was for meaning, the sense that what she was doing mattered, that the hours were not simply exchanged for money, but were being used in the direction of something she believed in. This had not always been available, and she had missed it when it wasn't. And finally, not replacing the others, but available alongside them, she had found it was for the practice, the daily showing up and doing of the thing, the development that happened not from the outcomes, but from the repetition, the craft of it, the accumulated skill, the way the years of doing made the doing richer. She had needed all of these answers at different times. She was glad the final one had arrived. She thought it was the one she could sustain indefinitely, regardless of how the others varied. Story 33. The person she was becoming. She had found, in the middle of her career, that the question she was most interested in was not what she was achieving, but who she was becoming through the work. The achievements were real, and she was glad of them, but they were, in a sense, what had happened. The person she was becoming was what was happening, the ongoing process, still in motion, still forming. The work had made her more patient, more willing to say she didn't know, more interested in the people than she had been at the beginning, when she had been more interested in the problems. These were changes she could trace to specific experiences, specific failures, specific encounters with people who had shown her something. She thought about this when she thought about what the career had been for. It had been for many things: the money, the contribution, the relationships, the daily engagement of the mind. But it had also been for this: the making of a person, slowly, through the encounter with hard things and other people and her own responses to both. She was still being made. She thought this was the right condition to be in. Story 34. The last story. He had reached a point in his career where he had more past in it than future, and he had found that the perspective from this point was different from any perspective he had had before. He could see, from here, how things had connected, how the work in one period had made possible the work in a later period, how the people he had met had led to other people, how the decisions he had agonized over had turned out to be less consequential than he had believed, and how the ones he had made quickly had sometimes determined more. He had found, looking back, that the career was a more coherent story than it had felt while he was inside it. Inside it, it had felt like a series of mostly disconnected choices made with incomplete information. From this perspective, he could see the thread. He did not know what the thread looked like from the outside. That was for others to say, if they were inclined to say anything. What he knew was what it had been like from the inside, and what it had cost, and what it had given him, and what he had made of himself in it. He was glad of the career. He was glad also that there was still some of it left. Story 35. The Thing About Showing Up. He had worked alongside someone for years who had no exceptional talent, but had been more reliable than anyone he had known, and the reliability had made them more valuable than talent alone would have. The person showed up. Not just physically. Everyone showed up physically, that was the baseline. They showed up attentively, prepared, having done the thing they had said they would do. They showed up in the difficult moments, when the project was not going well, when the team needed someone to hold something, when the less glamorous but necessary work needed doing. He had compared them, privately, to other colleagues who were more talented in the conventional sense, more quick, more creative, more impressive in the moments that were being assessed. Those colleagues were also valuable. But in the extended run, across years and difficult periods, the reliable person had been the person you could count on, and counting on turned out to be rarer and more valuable than he had previously understood. He had tried to be reliable himself as a result. He had found it required consistent attention rather than natural endowment. He had found it produced trust in a way that the more impressive qualities did not always produce. Trust, he thought, was the foundation that everything else was built on. Story 36. The Last Thing. She had been given career advice by many people across the years of her career, and the advice that had proved most useful had come from the least expected source. She had been early in her career and had been asking an older administrator, not a senior person in the conventional sense, someone who had worked in the same supporting role for 30 years, for information about a process. He had answered the question and then had said, as she was leaving, "Do you want a piece of advice?" She had said yes. He had said, "Learn the names of the people who keep things running, not the people whose names everyone knows, the others. Learn their names and use them and thank them specifically. You will be better at everything for it." She had taken this advice. It had been good advice in every respect she could assess. It had been good for the people she thanked, who were often not thanked specifically. It had been good for her in the understanding it required of how things actually worked. It had been good for the work, in every context. She thought of the administrator sometimes when she gave advice to younger people. She tried to give advice that simple and that useful. She was not always able to. Story 37. The Best Year. She had had a best year at work, and she had known while she was in it that it was a best year, and she had paid close attention because she thought the attention would help her understand what had made it best and how to find it again. The year had several components. The work itself had been the right difficulty, hard enough to require everything she had, achievable enough that she was making real progress. The team had been excellent in the specific way of teams that trusted each other. The organization had given her the autonomy she needed. She had been in good health and sleeping well. She had tried to hold these conditions in her mind as things to look for. She had also noticed that she could not have manufactured any of them individually. Each had arrived through a combination of choice and circumstance. She could make conditions more likely. She could not guarantee them. She had had the best year. She had not had another exactly like it. She had had other good years, differently configured. She held the best year as a reference point for what was possible, not as a standard against which to measure and find every other year lacking. And that is the end of tonight's stories. You have heard about promotions and pitches, apprenticeships and career changes, night shifts and deadlines, a watchmaker's patience and a teacher's quiet faith. You have heard the English of ambition, the language of effort and doubt, and the slow building of something that lasts. Work is where we spend much of our waking lives, And the English of work, the conversations, the setbacks, the moments of unexpected kindness or recognition, is English worth knowing deeply. We hope tonight's stories have added a few more words, a few more phrases, a few more rhythms to your growing understanding of this language. If you would like more, please subscribe to Cozy English. New stories every week on every topic. Share this video with someone who is learning English. There is no better way to absorb a language than gently while at rest. Good night, rest well, and tomorrow, whatever your work is, do it with care.